Right. Good afternoon to those of you who are present here. Good morning, afternoon, or evening to people who may be listening anywhere on the Zoom. My talk today is, as you will have noticed, about Edmund, the king of East Anglia, who became a saint and martyr, and who became one of the greatest saints of medieval England. My work on Edmund, which I've been doing in my retirement, is really linked in with a project done by Richard Hoggart on Vikings in Breckland. And he is doing a talk in this series in January on the East Vikings within East Anglia. So this talk is very much a predecessor to that talk. But when I was doing this, I got interested in Edmund, who he was, what do we know about him, and how his legend developed over the centuries from just one single line, if you like, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, into whole books written about the legend and the story of Edmund. And when I say books, of course, we're talking the days before printing, which is important, because when we think of a man writing a book about the life of St Edmund, if somebody else likes that book, he can't just go down to a bookshop and buy one. He has to pay someone to make a copy of it. And every time someone makes a handwritten copy of one of these books, there's always a possibility, indeed a probability, that bits will be left out by mistake, that the second person writing may disagree, may put in some different facts, additional facts. So you get all that when we talk about books written in the 13th, 14th century about Edmund, King of East Anglia. We've almost never got the original handwritten book by the monk or whoever it might be who wrote it. We've got some later copy with a possibility of additions, or bits taken out or bits interpreted. When we first think of Edmund, in fact, the first real bit of information is not in the book at all, it's in some coins. Scatters of coins, Edmund, King of East Anglia, and not dated. Coins aren't in those times, but they're sufficient to show that there was such a person and that he reigned for a few years, enough for his mint to print out coins and for those to be hoarded or whatever and found since. In terms of actual documents, first reference is indeed in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which, as you will know, is a series of books kept in monasteries and similar, recording events as they happened. And later editions, of course, copy the old lines and add bits that are happening in their time. So we think that it's been more or less contemporary. The one that mentions Edmund is one that comes from the kingdom of Alfred, Wessex. So this particular Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is mainly interested in Wessex, to be honest, which is why you get a lot of pages about Alfred and only one line about Edmund. It doesn't necessarily mean he was that unimportant compared to Alfred, but it means that the writer of this chronicle was interested in Alfred, only marginally interested in Edmund. And all he says about Edmund, I can give you the exact quote, this is it. In that year, we'll come to that in a moment, Edmund the king fought against the Danes, and the Danes took the victory and killed the king. So we got him being killed. That is in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for the year 870. Which is already wrong, because it's not wrong, that's a totally unfair word to use, because the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is starting the year from a different time, it's starting the year from September. So we're just saying what happened in the autumn of 870, as it is written in the Chronicle, is the martyrdom of Edmund actually took place by our standards in the autumn of 869. So that we can be pretty certain is the correct date for this death of Edmund by the Danes. His day, and this is one reason we're doing the talk at this time of year, is the 20th of November. And I think that carries a lot of weight. It's always, as far back as we know in history, been the 20th of November as being St Edmund's Day, a very important day in the Middle Ages, when St Edmund was one of the top saints of East Anglia, indeed the whole of England. And of course, people remember the day because that is the day which, when someone is martyred, they of course immediately enter into the kingdom of Christ. So this is the kind of thing you remember over, because you obviously, a year later you say, oh, it's a year since Edmund was killed. Next generation you say, oh, it's 25 years from today St Edmund is killed, let us go and say some prayers for him or to him, as it might be. So I think that's, although it's not mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in fact it is 20th of November, is I think pretty solid day. And that's all there is in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Indeed, that's all there is in any written source, except for one rather dubious one. If I get on to the next one, I should say, of course, that these pictures, although I hope you find them interesting, and they are, show the cult of St Edmund as it developed over the years. Not one of them is within 250 years of the time of St Edmund. So therefore they are entirely based on the legend, on the story, and what the people are wearing and what they look like. These people, the people who did the carvings of the paintings, had no idea, probably knew less than we did about the Vikings and about what the Anglo-Saxons were wearing and looked like. So we've already jumped now, this is 1390s, and this is the most famous image of St Edmund. This is, of course, the wilted diptych in the National Gallery. This is the personal prayer image of Richard II, King Richard II, that's him kneeling at the front. So this is 1390s, and the three patron saints that he has adopted: John the Baptist, Edward the Confessor, and on the left, St Edmund holding the arrow. That's his attribute, if you like. Now remember, I was saying in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, more or less contemporary, refers to Edmund being killed by the Danes in 869 or 870, but in 869 in our terms. There's a man called Asa, who was a friend of King Alfred's, and who wrote a life of Alfred, which he says he wrote in 893, so it's only 20 years or so after the death of Edmund. And he expands upon the line in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and he talks about how Edmund was killed fighting in battle, and a large number of East Anglian nobles were also killed in the fight against the Danes. That raises a couple of questions. One is, did Asa actually know anything? Or did he just make it up? Based on taking the line in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and saying, oh, this must be what happened. There must have been a great big battle. Anglo-Saxons must have died nobly. And there must have been many people killed. And just to add to the interest and the excitement of studying this kind of ancient history, there are some people, although this book by King Asa, not by King, by Asa, friend of King Alfred, who was bishop, claims to be written in 893. Some people, a minority, but some quite high-powered scholars, think it's a total forgery and was written 150 years later. How can you tell? Because, of course, any surviving copies we have, as I say, aren't going to be written in 893. They are going to be much, much later copies. And the majority of people do think it's a genuine text of Asa, Bishop of Sherborne, I think, and friend of Alfred, and with his extra detail about the battle in which King Edmund died. And that's quite interesting, because we shall come to the full legend itself. We shall find that there was no battle, according to a traditional legend of King Alfred, of King Edmund. The next bit of evidence, we go back to coins. You get a whole large number of coins within 20 years, 30 years of Edmund's death, acclaiming Edmund as a saint and martyr. So here, even before we got any documents, any weighty documents saying this, we've got the actual coins. There's over 2,000 of these coins, which is a lot, admittedly. 1,800 of them are all in one hoard or one collection, as it were, which was found in Lancashire. But nevertheless, it shows a lot of coins are being printed recognizing Edmund already as a saint and martyr within 30 years of his death. Some of them have King Alfred on one side and King Edmund on the other. So we're presumably printed within Alfred's lifetime, which 903 or something he died. So again, within 30 years of St Edmund's death, we have coins acclaiming him already to be a saint and a martyr. And so that's showing it already. And those coins, apart from that collection, which I mentioned being particularly in Lancashire, where we found the 1800, of the other 200, most are, as you would expect, within the kingdom of East Anglia, so local to Edmund's area. People are recognizing him as a saint and martyr within 20, 30 years, according to the coin evidence. And there, just to carry another view of him as a martyr, that is, of course, a modern image at St Edmund's, just to show you that we range in these images. The earliest I know is 1130s down to the present day. People are still creating images of St Edmund, stressing him sometimes as a warrior, sometimes as a martyr. And then we have a great big gap. A great big gap from, say, 900 AD, 869 to 900, until 983, 983 AD. And that is about when a man called Abbo wrote the legend, the Passio, the Passion of St Edmund. And this is the story. If you know the details of the so-called life above all the death of St Edmund, this is where you're getting him from. A man called Abbo wrote them down in 983, which is 115 years after Edmund was killed. So how did Abbo know? He tells us. He spans back 115 years. He was a monk in Ramsey Abbey on the Fens, and was a friend of Archbishop Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury. And it was Archbishop Dunstan who told him to write the life and death of Edmund. Now, Dunstan of his time was, I think, in his 70s. So he was quite an old man, probably a pretty old man by most standards of those times, but not old enough, of course, to remember Edmund. So how did Dunstan get his information? He tells us, Abbo tells us. When Dunstan was a child, or a very young man, at the royal court, as a monk, young monk, novice, this very old and feeble man came into the court. And he, so he claimed, as a child, had been the armor bearer of St Edmund. So that's a direct line. You see, Abbo is writing it down. He is getting it from Dunstan as an old man. Dunstan, when he was a child, came across this armor bearer. I don't think we have his name. Came across his armor bearer as an old man who recalled when he was a child, he was present at the death of Edmund. So there we are. You see, reliable, unreliable. Form your own conclusions. I think it's worth bearing in mind that, of course, in an age when very few people could write, it's arguable that people had better memories, in the sense they were more used to memorizing things and stories that people told and things like that. I mean, they say this about the New Testament, don't they? The Gospels were not written down in Jesus' lifetime, but by successive generations, but the sayings and the actions were in the memory of people, because of course they were thought to be important and significant, and so people remembered them. And so here, possibly so, people are remembering a man like Edmund because of his importance as a martyr, and remembering sayings that he said and actions that happened. Or are they exaggerating them for a good evening's entertainment? We will never know. But Abbo is the key man, and he tells us about the Vikings. He tells us that the Vikings arrived. This is the earliest illustration. This is the 1130s, again, many hundreds of years after the Vikings. But here they are arriving, and this one is I put in partly because Richard is using this, I think, as the title of his talk. So here are the Vikings arriving in their ships. Into East Anglia. When they arrive, and Edmund, who is king of East Anglia, king of East Anglians, is informed that they arrived, he doesn't as Asser implies, get all his men together and fight a great big battle. He adopts a Christ-like attitude, refuses to call his men together because he thinks they'll all be killed and it's a waste of life. And he goes individually to meet the Viking leaders. And he tries to convert them to Christianity. Presumably they try to convert him to paganism. But in either case, the result is Edmund becoming a martyr. And this is the story of Edmund. But we have most commonly, so it's not a battle, it's a deliberate martyrdom, drawing a parallel with Christ. Again, Abbo specifically says he's drawing a parallel between the life of Edmund and the life of Christ. The man who's going to his death, to his martyrdom, without committing violence. So the Danes tie him up. This is presumably a modern image. This is Southwold, which is dedicated, Southwold Church is dedicated to St Edmund. They tie him up, tie him to a tree. That's what they did, isn't it? They tie him to a tree and they fire arrows at him. This is Abbo telling us what Dunstan told him that the armor bearer had told him. They tie him to a tree and they fire arrows at him, like so. Now, those of you who are familiar with your saints will be reminded of St Sebastian. When you go to the National Gallery and see people who are having arrows fired at them or fired into them, like so, it's St Sebastian. And Abbo draws this parallel as well. He says, this is just like St Sebastian. So again, we ask ourselves, is he bending his story to make it sound more like St Sebastian? Or is he just happening to note that both of these men suffered the same fate? What's interesting about both these men is that neither of them were killed by the arrows. St Sebastian was actually clubbed to death in the end. What happened to Edmund, we shall see, but this is the standard image. This is why he had the arrow with him to mark who he was on the Wilton diptych. This is modern again, this is Roman Catholic Cathedral, St John's in Norwich. The arrows mark him. More subtle. If you look carefully at that, you can see that is Edmund. He is, by his death, by his martyrdom, conquering the Vikings. So that's the Vikings at the bottom, the Viking at the bottom. And if you look at this closely, you can see that the Viking is carrying his arrows. And this is in the cloister at Norwich Cathedral. You go to Norwich Cathedral cloister and look at the prior's door, as it's called, and you have the image of St Edmund with the arrows, but the arrows more tastefully hidden in this case. Now the arrows fail to kill him. Therefore, the Vikings, and this is a 15th century image, did the painter, I suppose, of this image have any idea what Vikings look like? But you can see what they are doing. There is St Edmund, or not quite a saint yet, there is Edmund. He has been fired at with arrows until Abbo has a rather telling phrase, he bristled like a hedgehog. That is him there, bristling like a hedgehog. And they get fed up. Either that, I'm never quite sure whether they intended to kill him with the arrows, and it was like sort of God's miracle that they didn't, or whether it was just a form of torture. But in the end, they get fed up with it and they chop his head off, execute him. So that's what's happening here. And then, having chopped his head off, they deliberately hide it in the wood. According to Abbo, this takes place in a place called Higgleston. We may have time to think about where that was, but we may not, we will see. And then a miracle occurs. So they throw away the head, deliberately hide it in the thickest part of a wood, so that the Saxons can't find it and can't give Edmund a respectable, honourable burial. They throw it away. Then, according to Abbo, it's going to be rather different. Time may come when Abbo do sing a song about St Edmund, but according to Abbo, the miracle that occurs is that a wolf who is in the forest, there still were wolves in forest in East Anglia in 869, the wolf finds the head and guards it and brings it back to Edmund's friends and supporters. So that's what's happening here. And in this one, there are two stories going on at the same time. At the top left, on the left-hand side, you can see the friendly wolf. He is given the head to one of Edmund's supporters. And down here, others of his supporters join the head to the body. And this is miracle number 2. Miracle number 1 is the wolf. Miracle number 2 is the head and the body miraculously joined together. So when you look at Edmund's body after this, later generations look at his body, there's just a little red line around there, like a necklace, showing where the head and body miraculously joined, according to Abbo. And this, you see, you get the whole element of a story conveyed in this, which is on the outside of St Lawrence Church in Westwick, in St Benedict's, go down to St Benedict's. You can see this, and you can see there's a chap bristling like a hedgehog. He's quite old and he's a king, so he's not Sebastian. Arrows are being fired at him, and the friendly wolf is looking out of his lair at the bottom corner. So all the legends gathered together in this sculpture, which is entirely based on the legend as given by Abbo. Abbo writing 115 years after the death of Edmund. And then what happens is they make a little chapel in this place called Higgleston, and they bury Edmund in it. Okay. But 33 years later, according to Abbo, who's still Abbo, his reputation has increased so much that they want to take him out of that little chapel and bury him where he can be revered properly by monks. And so they take him to bury St Edmund's. That's the origin of bury St Edmund's, but that wasn't his first place of burial. 33 years earlier, he'd been buried at the scene of his martyrdom. 33 years is always suspicious because, according to traditional theology, it is the exact length of time Christ was on this earth. And so when these people writing about saints are saying something that took exactly 33 years, are they sort of making that parallel between the life of Christ? For example, Bede says about St Hilda, that she spent exactly 33 years as a laywoman, and then exactly 33 years in the monastery. And of course, she may have done, until something must have happened exactly 33 years after other things, but people doubt and wonder if they are deliberately drawing that parallel with Christ. 33 years they moved from Bury St Edmunds, from Higgleston, unidentified, into Bury St Edmunds, and of course that's the start of the massive abbey, shrine, the pilgrimages, parliaments being held in Bury St Edmunds, all the rest of it. Bury St Edmunds. Somebody said on Radio Norfolk, it was like at the weekends, somebody said that they used to go to Bury St Edmunds shopping as a family, and they used to have a family joke. They used to get in their car and say, "Oh, we're all off to Bury St Edmunds." And then one of them would say, "Oh, I didn't know he was dead." The point being, of course, that the word bury in Bury St Edmunds doesn't mean he was buried there, although he was, as it happens. The word bury in there means for fortified town, the same word as burg, borough, same word. It's for borough of St Edmund, the fortified town dedicated to St Edmund. Good parallel, Peterborough, fortified town dedicated to St Peter. And then, as soon as they killed him, according to Abbo, the Vikings leave. There they are doing it. Again, in the 1130s, manuscript. And then we have to wait another 100 years for our next written source. And after that, they start coming thick and fast. So by the time we're getting into, say, the early 12th century, say 200 years, or more, 200 to 250 years after Edmund has died, other people are telling his legend, his story, and adding bits, going beyond Abbo. And again, we've got to ask ourselves, how did they know? Because obviously we've no longer got that direct line from one person, the armor bearer, down to Dunstan, and then down to Abbo himself. These ones, first one, which is a monk in St Edmund called Herman, talks about, according to the testimony of our ancestors, according to the traditions of our predecessors, words like that. So it's getting not so definite and much more possibly dubious, because they're writing more and more about the legend of St Edmund, and pilgrims are coming to Bury and they want to know the story of St Edmund. So these people are supplying the need by writing these books. But how much historical research have they got behind them, and how much are they adding legend upon legend? Herman says that where Edmund was first buried, and I told you he was buried in a little chapel near Helston, was actually a place called Sutton. Abbo doesn't mention that. Herman says it. Did he know? Did he have some tradition to tell him that he was buried in a place called Sutton? Possibly. Possibly he was confusing his martyrs, because there's an earlier member of the Saxon royal family who was killed at Sutton in Herefordshire, killed by Offa, King of Mercia. So possibly Herman has got that story muddled up with the story of Edmund, bearing in mind both are taking place at least 250 years before he was writing. We don't know. And then you get later ones, the Annal of St Neots, which is written in Bury, despite its funny name, which tells us more about the life of Edmund, that he was crowned at Bures in Suffolk. A man called Geoffrey of Wells, writing about 1215, tells us, and this is a legend that people know about in East Anglia, that Edmund was not actually born in East Anglia. Abbo doesn't say anything about this, but Geoffrey of Wells is the first to say that he was actually the son of a king of Saxony, where the Saxons originated from, in Germany, and that he came over to rule East Anglia. And this is the tradition on the sign at Hunstanton, for example, that he landed at or near Hunstanton, St Edmund's Point, and there's a chapel in Hunstanton, ruins, supposedly relating to St Edmund. But none of the early people mentioned that. You see, it's not mentioned Abbo, it's not mentioned Herman, it's not mentioned until 250 years after the events, at least. People are filling in. The thing about Abbo is that he was very much concerned with the death. He wasn't very concerned with the life of St Edmund. So he doesn't tell us things like this, where he was crowned or where he is. He does say he came from noble Saxon stock. And a lot of people think that Geoffrey Wells has made a bit of a mistake here. He's assumed that by saying he came from noble Saxon stock, he means he came actually from Saxony and was related to the king of Saxony at the time. But really, Abbo just means he was one of the nobles of the East Anglian kingdom of East Anglia. In that sense, was a noble Saxon, and therefore Geoffrey Wells is, I hesitate to say this, making it all up, but possibly not. Possibly has some genuine tradition going back into the past. But this is how it goes, builds up. You see legend after legend, these stories, the books get bigger and bigger. More and more facts piled on. And we get more and more suspicious as to how true they might be. One activity of Edmund, which people are still interested in and still debate all these years, 1,000 years later and more, is where these events actually happened. If there was a battle, where did it take place? If there was a martyrdom, tying to a tree and being executed, where did that take place? And people continue to argue about that as people try and interpret, try and guess where he might have done this, to be honest. Abbo, or at least the writings we now have of Abbo, bear in mind, we haven't got the original one that he wrote in 893, we've only got later versions handwritten by people who may have added things. Says he died at a place called Higgleston, roughly. I'm quite sure how you pronounce it, which sounds like Helston. So a lot of people say, oh yes, Helston, this is a very modern town sign, Helston, which takes that line, says yes, he died at Helston. Snagged about it, there's never been any tradition of St Edmund dying at Helston. You'd thought there would be a chapel or a shrine or memories of some kind. There aren't. There are, where there are, is a place that doesn't sound anything like Higgleston at all. There's Hoxton, just on the border between Suffolk and Norfolk. Yes, their sign, you see, again, the key elements, tree and the king, his crown and the arrows. And Hoxton has a long, long tradition of Edmund being killed there. One of the things you can still do is you go to a medieval bridge at Hoxton, and people will tell you, if you're getting married, you shouldn't cross that bridge, it's bad luck. Why is it bad luck? Because under that bridge, King Edmund, when he was hiding from the Danes after the battle, it was a battle, but this is the tradition, when he was hiding from the Danes after the battle, he hid under this bridge. The sun glinted on his gold spurs. Danes saw them and dragged him out. That's a bridge in Hoxton, medieval bridge. There's a tree, there used to be a tree in Hoxton, which came down in the 19th century, Victorian times, which supposedly had arrowhead, which might, if you believe all this sort of stuff, have been one of the arrows fired at St Edmund. But we don't know. Just to finish off, in the last 120 years, there have been many more people guessing at this. This is something people like to guess at. Chap also, Lord Francis Harvey, writing 120 years ago now, probably more. He took up the line. Remember, I told you that Herman says that the burial of Edmund after his martyrdom took place at a place called Sutton. Where's the obvious place in East Anglia called Sutton, associated with Saxon royal people? Sutton Hoo. So Francis Harvey thought it took place in Sutton Hoo, so he's favouring the Herman line of Sutton and not worrying too much about Abbo's Higgleston. I think the nearest he suggests is Hollesley. In the 1980s, a chap called Stanley West, archaeologist, made an interesting discovery. He looked at a map, a tithe map for Bradfield St Clair in Suffolk, just 4 miles from St Edmunds. Tithe maps have field names, and he noticed there was a field on this map called Helsden, and indeed called Helsden Ley, ley meaning sort of clearing, implying that there was a wood, just a sort of place where you have to hide a man's head after you decapitated him. And so people got all excited in the 1980s and said, oh yes, that makes sense. So it's not the town of Helsden, it's this little field or area of woodland in this little town of Bradfield St Clair, just 4 miles away from Bury St Edmunds, and not so far to carry a body. Possibilities, and a lot of, probably most, sort of relatively recent history books tend to take that line. I think I did in my Bury St Edmunds, and then that was written when I was a young man, easily persuaded by written sources. The snag is, there's an awful long gap between Abbo in 983 talking about Helsden and the tithe map of 1843 mentioning the name Helsden on it, and another chap called Briggs who's done some work in looking at much older documents for Bradfield St Clair, saying, does this name show up on medieval title deeds, manorial extents of the 13th, 14th century? And he couldn't find it anywhere. So he had came to a conclusion that it was a much more modern name, something called John Helsden, something that happened to live there in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, and his name had stuck to the field. It was a chap called Briggs, and he was saying yes because he had an axe to grind. He wanted to prove it was yet another place with a name similar to Helsden, which is near Malden in Essex. That one does have the advantage, because I think I told you, I should have, if not, I should have made clearer, the story in Abbo is that as soon as they chopped off Edmund's head, the Vikings got into their boats and went away. It might seem to imply that it was a coastal area, or at least on a big river. Again, if you think that Abbo had any information of any fact, so that's the line I think it's Keith Briggs takes. I should say that all these articles, all these lines about research into King Edmund can be found in Suffolk Archaeology. Have a look at Suffolk Archaeology, you'll find all these articles by all these different people, some favouring Hoxton, some favouring Bradfield Sinclair, and someone at least favouring Malden. And if you don't know, I expect you probably do, but if you don't, both Suffolk Archaeology and Norfolk Archaeology are available online. So you can sit down in the comfort of your own home and read all these articles and many thousands of other fascinating ones. And if and when lockdown resumes, you'll be grateful for that fantastic resource. But just to finish off, so I'm going on and on, I'm really talking about the early life of Edmunds, the early story of Edmunds, how it's developed over the centuries and how it becomes so big. So we go back to this, by this time, 1390s, Wilton diptych. Here is Edmund, recognisable because of his arrow. And he is one of the patron saints of England, really, before St George. He is that important. Parliaments come to bury St Edmunds so they can be held around his shrine. And his shrine is fantastic. By the 15th century, is a fantastic jewelled, huge coffin type thing which people go and pray, where miracles take place. Interesting enough, Herman says that no miracles took place when he was buried in that little chapel when he had died. Miracles only took place when he was taken out of there and brought to bury St Edmunds. And why does Herman say that? Because he is a monk at bury St Edmunds and wants you all to know that it was the act of moving the saint's body to bury St Edmunds that pleased the saint so much he started working miracles of healing and power, according to Herman. So I tried to take you from the very beginnings, the coins, just one line in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, right up to the greatness of St Edmund in the Middle Ages. I haven't said that much about the Vikings, who they were, why they killed him, and the reason for that, as I am leaving that to Richard Hoggett. Again, we return to this image, who will be talking about Viking East Anglia, part 2. I regard myself as a mere John the Baptist to Richard's Jesus, and he is doing his talk on the 19th of January